Fortunately, stones the size of mountains don't fall from the sky very often. Objects the size of the one that formed Meteor Crater hit the Earth around once or twice per 1,000 years. The asteroid that formed the Reese Crater is perhaps a 1 in a million year event. On the 1 in 100 million year timescale, the Earth is hit by a 10-kilometer sized object. Surprisingly, it's the objects greater than 10 meters that start to become really worrisome. In 1908, a meteor exploded in the atmosphere above Tunguska in central Siberia. The blast flattened trees over an area of 3,000 square kilometers.
If you imagine what happened with Tunguska, and imagine if you take that from Siberia and put it into downtown London or into Europe, and imagine the consequences. Now you magnify that to the scale that we see at Rio Cuarto, up by a factor of 10 to 100. Then you realize that we are dealing with some massive effects on the local populace. This is not causing a global extinction event, but it would cause a regional devastation that would, I think, change not just attitudes but religions. I think if we now scale that up to a more even rarer event, for example, I estimate Rio Cuarto would have been about a once in 4 million year event to be able to occur on land at that angle. So now let's think about something that is maybe another factor of 5, 10 bigger. Then I think it really depends on where it occurs. Is it on ocean? Is it on land? And I also think it depends on what the angle is. I think you need the big events, the things that are larger than about 2, 3 kilometers across to do global mass murder of the Earth. You need to have a much bigger event than Rio Cuarto.
In February 1994, a large explosion occurred over the Pacific Ocean, equivalent to perhaps 10 to 100 kilotons of TNT. It was seen by Japanese fishermen, but otherwise went unnoticed, despite being the largest event in more than a decade. Most of these smaller objects are usually stopped by the atmosphere. Using satellites designed to detect the launch of nuclear weapons and to track space debris, the United States Air Force monitors the atmosphere for explosions all the time.
One of the benefits of the monitoring space debris and entry vehicles has been that there now is a much greater realization that we are slammed a lot more often than we had believed by objects coming from outer space. The one that the Japanese fishermen saw, that particular event I think was about a 20 kiloton event, so it was something that was major. It didn't cause massive extinctions or massive life loss, but it was clearly a brilliant flash. How big it was really depends. For example, if it were a comet, or if it were a fluffy ball, or if it were an asteroid, they would each have different scales and different depths of penetration. That's one of the reasons why it's important to understand the provenance of these objects, whether or not they are simply occasional interlopers, or whether or not these are disasters waiting to happen, that is, that they're in Earth-crossing orbits. It's important to find out what type of objects these are. It's also important to monitor this in a real way. That's why the Shoemaker-Levy collision was so important on Jupiter. We were witness to an event that would have caused probably mass extinction on the Earth, and we were able to witness it in an armchair on the Earth. I think that's the type of thing that we can learn by scaling all these different events. The one that the Japanese fishermen saw, the ones that we see at Rio Cuarto, and other craters on the Earth.
Tales of falling asteroids keep us all hooked now on BBC Learning Zone as the OU takes up the tale of the meteorite which landed in Britain in 1795.
You may be wondering what an 18th century coaching inn has got to do with stones falling from the sky. Well, the George at Stamford, which was on the Great North Road between London and York in the late 1700s, actually would have featured very prominently in the toings and froings of the first recognised British meteorite, which fell in Yorkshire at a place called Wold Cottage in 1795. Edward Topham, the owner of the land in Yorkshire, would have stopped here on his way to find out what had happened. In 1795, the British were at war with the French. The Napoleonic Wars had just started. And so when the residents of Wold Cottage heard a loud report, a loud bang, they naturally thought it was something to do with the war, and in fact they thought that the French were shelling the coast at Bridlington at 8 miles away. But the 56-pound object, the sort of football-sized rock, which landed in Topham's field, made a hole which would be equivalent of approximately the equivalent of an artillery shell of that kind of power. The actual meteorite penetrated something like 20 inches, and it took John Shipley and 2 of his friends some hours to dig the stone out before they could carry it to the house. As an inveterate newspaperman, in fact he'd founded a paper called the World. He saw that he had a story on his hands, and he brought his stone back to London and put it on display in a place called the Gloucester Coffee House, which was near Piccadilly. Now, an important part about Mr. Topham in this story, that he was an extremely well-known personality in Regency London. He was a dandy. He was a man whose mistress was one of the foremost actresses of the day. The problem with Topham is that he was a magistrate, and he was very interested in the truth, and he wouldn't allow his men to embellish this story in any way. He asked them to give the testimonies that he used when he displayed the meteorite in an entirely factual form. So they were almost forced into giving it in a witness-like fashion. And in fact, he did swear these testimonies because there were a lot of people around at the time who doubted that stones could really fall from the sky. He went to great pains to explain to people that there were no volcanoes in the region of Yorkshire. The nearest volcano was in fact 800 miles away. And the reason why he did this is that there had been a stone that fell 100 years earlier in Italy, and people had associated the stone with an eruption of Vesuvius, which had occurred some 20 hours before. And Sir Joseph Banks, who was the president of the Royal Society at that time, commissioned a chemical analysis, and he was able to show that all the meteorites contained both metallic iron, and the metallic iron was contaminated by nickel. Now, not only is metallic iron very rare in terrestrial rocks, but iron with nickel associated with it is almost unheard of, because during terrestrial geological processes, the iron is settled out of the rocks into the Earth's core and taken the nickel with it. It's extremely fortunate for meteoritics that Edward Topham, in fact, lived in Yorkshire at all at this time. I've already said he was involved with a well-known actress of the time, Mrs. Wells. To say the very least, Mrs. Wells was unstable. She'd become a stalker of George III, among other of her escapades. He retired to Yorkshire almost to escape her. It was extremely fortunate for science that it fell on his land, because as a magistrate and the son of a judge, he was somebody who had an implicit and absolute belief in truth.